So I have a lot of friends who like Monster Hunter, friends and family. Now, usually, because my friends and my family know that I'm trans, it's not like I hide it. If they find a character in something, they'll usually be like, "Hey, Soul, you should check this out." It's kind of like when you come out as gay to any capacity, and your family finds a show that has like a gay couple in it, and suddenly you're getting messages or phone calls, and they're like, "Hey, you should watch this show. There's a gay couple in it." And it's never because of anything else in the media. It's because specifically there's a gay couple, and they think that you'll immediately be invested in it. Anyway, people do that to me with trans characters too, and so you can imagine my surprise when I started getting told that there's a trans character in Monster Hunter Wilds, a game that no one who I know who's played has mentioned to me. That was very wild to find out, actually. So, the discussion that I will be having today will be, well, is Erik trans? But okay, the answer here is, at least to our knowledge, no. Sorry to disappoint you. I did look into it. I watched a full game movie. I scoured the wikis. I talked to everyone I know who's played the game, and I asked them about him, and I tried to get to the bottom of it. And I realized that it is mostly a headcanon. There's really nothing about it in the game that would imply that it's the case. There's nothing in the game that would imply that it isn't the case. There are other characters that I like where there are trans headcanons, such as Soren from Fire Emblem, for example, where the canon lore really easily disproves that headcanon. So it obviously was definitely not intended by the developers, and there's no reason for me to view it in any capacity beyond a headcanon in cases like that. With Erik, it's kind of middling, I would say, because there's nothing that would disprove it, but there's also nothing in the game that even really implies it. So but there is more to talk about because this has sparked quite a discussion among like forums about him. You can't really go to any forum where he's mentioned and you don't have people arguing about it. So we do need to talk about it for sure. But the disappointing factor is that no, there's nothing in the game that actually has any implication of it. So unfortunate, but true. Before we get into that discussion, I want to take a moment again in this video to bring the discussion, mention something that I mentioned in the last video. We're discussing trans characters in this series, particularly we're discussing transmasculine characters or analysis, allegory, what have you. And discussing trans rights is inherently political. I I don't understand how that might not be the case. Do I love that it is a inherently politicized topic? Absolutely not. I wish that we could just discuss trans and, otherwise LGBT media without it having to be in like an othered category. I wish I could go into a bookstore and get a book that has LGBT characters in it without that book having to be in the LGBT category. I don't love what this says about us or our world, that discussing transness in any capacity automatically marks something as political, but the fact of the matter is that it does, especially with trans people being targeted, especially in the United States right now. So you're here watching a video about transness and discussion. Then I also think that it's important to discuss other incredibly, important political issues that I think overlooking is um like I said in the last video, I think it's cowardly to overlook what is happening in Palestine and to overlook what is happening in Ukraine. And I will be again going over my resources for you to go check out, to go donate, to share. Specifically, what's been happening right now in Palestine, people are starving and people will be attacked and murdered if they're going to seek out food. It's horribly disturbing. I do suggest that yes, you pay attention to what's happening, and in a much similar vein, Uh, in Ukraine, there was a horrific attack in Kiev just a few days ago upon me recording this. Multiple families dead, children. It I don't understand how you could be watching a video about a political topic and just blissfully ignoring this. So, for my resources, we have the Comeback Alive Foundation, we have the National Bank of Ukraine, we have the Serhiy Pertula Charity Foundation, the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, the Palestine Red Crescent Society, and Doctors Without Borders. And all those links are once again in the description. And I do urge you to check them out and to not ignore this. I know that it's ignoring it feels easier and watching videos to escape from it feels easier, but I promise you, it's not doing anything. And since we're on the topic of addenduming and discussing, before I talk about Erik again, this is sort of a mini episode. I do have something actually slated for episode 2. In fact, there's the video of me shaking the box at the end of the last episode. So the actual next episode is going to be about a indie book anthology, and I am working on that too. That one is a bit more collaborative. I have a partner who I am working on with for that video, hence why it's taking a little bit longer, because I have to wait for his part in it. I have to do more art assets for it. So that one is in progress, but that's why this one might be uploaded first, or if not, second. And then in that case, I guess I'll just cut this out. But I did want to say thank you for the very enthusiastic reception upon the introduction video. I was not expecting that. I thought that maybe like 40 people would watch it, not 8,000 plus. So I'm not sure how to respond. The visibility has me a little bit nervous, but I will continue this. And, you know, if you find these videos useful, if you like these discussions, that's wonderful. I'm going through every single reply. I got hundreds of replies between Blue Sky and YouTube, and some in Discord to my original prompt where I asked people to list, 5 pieces of media with transmasculine characters. And I'm sure this video is coming from. This is one of the things that got listed, and I wanted to look into it. But I'm going through every single suggestion. I'm writing every single suggestion down. And as I go through and I buy all these books and I read them and I check out some of these movies and these games and I look into all this, I'm sure that will add on to the things I will talk about and find and will feel that are worth talking about. So that's where this came from, and that's kind of what I've been working on for the past little while in regards to this project. So is Erik a case of transcoding? Or is this just a case of trans headcanon, say, likely in regards to the fact that his voice actor is non-binary? I I actually think it's the latter, unfortunately. Or fortunately. I think it's a nuanced discussion. I'm not sure how I feel about the idea that a character having a trans or a non-binary voice actor immediately equals to the character being transcoded in the minds of a lot of viewers. I think that trans people, as voice actors, as actors, should be allowed to portray characters that aren't inherently trans. I wish that we lived in a world where that was the case. But I also understand that trans voice actors voicing a character is in a lot of cases intentional transcoding. There's an example of this in She-Ra, actually. The character, he is canonically transmasculine, but he's only in like one episode, so definitely not a character I think that I'll be making a full discussion on, but he's interesting. The story behind it is interesting. She-Ra's not a bad show. I like generally a lot of what N.D. Stevenson does, but he's never stated to be trans. He's simply coded as trans. It's implied, I think, with one like image, like showing them together, like because he's there with his two sisters. I think there's an image that shows them together before he transitioned. I could be wrong. It's been a while since I watched that show. I know that the character that he's a reboot version of was originally a female character, and of course his voice actor is a trans man, so that's ergo transcoding that was obviously intentional for his character, which is a very clever way to get around censors, if nothing else, and a lot of shows and games do have to do that. So when discussing, like, is Erik transcoded, that would probably be how, yeah, they would code him as trans, realistically speaking, if they wanted to, it be to get a trans voice actor. So I understand, how people got to the conclusion that they did. So one half of this discussion is people very affectionately being like, "Oh, we have trans rep. Oh, this is cool. Oh, we love this." And a lot of it is kind of headcanon-y, like I said. There's nothing in the actual game that really leads you to this implication, other than literally his voice actor, which again I've said is it's not always intentional transcoding, and in this case I really don't think that it was. I am happy that a non-binary voice actor is finding work. That's about my grand takeaway on it. I like him as a character as well. Like, I think that he's a very fun character. I And then the other half of the discussion are people who are being very transphobic, who are upset that his voice doesn't sound, I don't know how to describe it, like standardly masculine. Because let's be real, it's not that the voice actor is non-binary, it's that the voice actor's voice to a lot of people is reading as very androgynous, which it's a little goofy. I don't know what word to say. It's a little bit goofy. That's why people are even saying this, like, positively or negatively. And it's not as if, like, women voicing male characters is like a thing that doesn't happen. That happens all the time. Any male character that's kind of like a pretty boy character, or that are like young boys, they often have women voicing them because they don't like the people who are, making the game or the show don't want him to have a very masculine sounding voice because he's not supposed to be a very masculine character, right? And it's very much in those cases not transcoding, it's just so that the voice matches the character design, that sort of thing. And in this case, I I suspect it was something kind of similar where they just wanted him to have either a higher pitched voice or a like mm, I don't know if I would say he's soft spoken, but you know what I mean, not like a very deep manly voice, because that doesn't quite suit his character. And then, we have to go from there to this idea of, like, what does him having a in the heaviest quotes I can use, more androgynous voice have to, like, how does that really imply anything? But furthermore, like, okay, let's say there was, let's say instead of the voice actor he had, there was a different trans voice actor voicing him, somebody with a more deep and masculine voice, then people, in all likelihood, wouldn't be proclaiming this so much as a headcanon, or as being upset and transphobic towards him. Like, that just wouldn't be the case. If there was a trans guy who had a very, like, cis masculine passing, I hate using these terms, voice, then people wouldn't be discussing his character like this. It is exclusively because his voice to a lot of people is not reading as particularly masculine. Um, that's literally all it is. And then on top of that, the voice actor being non-binary is kind of like the smoking gun in this case for a lot of people. But okay, let's talk about other character coding aspects, like what are things about his personality or a character that could lead to this sort of view of him. He's an eccentric person, not that that tells us anything. He's got the self-preservation of, like, a moth flying into a spider's web. He's very entertaining. Like, when I was watching all the cutscenes, I think I burst out laughing when he runs off to chase a butterfly in his character introduction. Like, he's really endearing. I think that it's kind of unanimously decided upon that he's probably very autistic. So, like, I get it. I think that the best way I can describe why people might be seeing him as trans in a positive sense is that I think that in most circles where there are groups of people who are trans, I think that we all know that trans guy who is extremely eccentric and autistic, and if you mention one thing about his special interest, he'll talk about it for the next 6 hours and forget to eat, right? Like, I think that we all know a guy like that. Um, and I think that him as a character, he's going to remind you of these people. He's going to kind of resonate with you in that sense because he has those characteristics. And and it's done in a way where I actually think that it's quite like endearing and fun. I think that as far as like autistic coding goes in characters, he's a very good example of it, and I thought that that was very cool. So I get how that combines with the transcoding as well, and I don't want to sit here and talk about like correlations between being like neurodivergent and trans. Like, these correlations, there's not a whole lot of studies behind them that are reliable. I don't like relying on using studies and numbers in these discussions anyways. And of course a correlation is never a causation. So this is definitely more a case of like observing social circles and I guess almost like a microsociological discussion where it's just like I understand this perception because I have seen these kinds of people frequently in these kinds of friend circles and, that sort of thing. And much like with any other kind of coding for a character, when it comes to coding for trans characters, there will be characteristics reminiscent of like not just transness, so i.e. things like body shape and voice and stuff like that, which I want to talk about a bit in a sec. I want to put a pin in my opinions on that. But there will be coding in terms of like personality and character as well. So like personality traits that are kind of associated with different demographics of trans people are things that you'll also see in transcoding. Now there kind of are, I guess I would say, two main perspectives on transcoding. For in this case we're going to be talking about transmasculine people, of course. There are ways to code transmasculine characters for people who are not transmasculine. They're observing us from the outside. And this includes like even other trans people because there are like some different stereotypes and experiences and that sort of thing. And this is not to say that it's always in bad faith. A lot of times it's in perfectly good faith. This is just sort of the angle of the point of view. And then transcoding from people who are transmasculine themselves. And the idea is they want the character to read as trans to you, obviously. So if you have transcoding from an outside perspective, it's going to be using stereotypes, or at least common sort of associations that other people have of us, not so much that we have of ourselves. And in the case of like transphobes, what are some of the extremely common ways they view transmasculine people? A really common one is the sort of like confused autistic girl who thinks that she's a boy, which is gross, but yes, that is a very common one that you will see. And typically in these cases, it will kind of be like sometimes the character will have some level of like trauma, or of course will have like I would say like bad faith autistic coding, like bordering on offensive if not offensive. And the character is presented probably as not having a lot of autonomy over his identity, or he was like tricked or manipulated because the idea is that like he doesn't, well, they'd be misgendering him obviously, but like he doesn't really know what's best for him in that situation, that sort of thing. And the focus is more on the like other adults or like the other people around him and how they feel about it, less about him as a character. And I would say good faith representations of trans guys, but still from an outside angle, there is still sort of this focus on how other people are perceiving him gender-wise and as a person. There's not really much perspective of him internally, of himself. The POV is all from outside of him. And the coding or the implications before maybe it becomes canonized later tends to be focused on things like his maybe his voice is higher pitched, maybe he doesn't really have any facial hair, maybe he has softer skin, maybe one of the characters figures out that he's binding his chest. Like, those are just all really common ones that you'll kind of see. um and in this case too, there is still like a lot of general autistic coding, partially because it's a stereotype, and also because it's just a common association. So those are things that you will see. There is one story that I'm going to discuss later in here that it's obviously good faith representation. It does kind of bear some of these similar things, and I think it's an interesting discussion in terms of the angle of the writing, in terms of like him being someone who's observed by someone else as opposed to us seeing his view of himself when his experiences are more internally. And so, like, how does this wrap around to coding involving any sort of physical feature, i.e., the voice or the body of the character? Personally, and this might be a personal take, I'm not the biggest fan when representation of transmasculine people or coding over relies on him having a not masculine sounding voice, or if it over relies on him having, like, also in quotes, feminine physical features, because that is also playing into a stereotype. It's playing into this idea that trans guys are softer, that we're still to some extent basically women, even if the story is trying to say that that's not the case. When you're over relying on these sorts of things and you don't have any other sort of like point of view or like moments where we get to see his point of view on himself. So this isn't me saying that like these things are always bad. They're not always bad. I think it's very important to have very nuanced trans rep, which would include showing in these sorts of things and showing how the characters feel about themselves, because not all of us transition the same way. Not all of us can transition medically, and you could have stories showing different stages of his life, and there are stories like that that I really love. But it's definitely a difference of point of view. Point of view is one of the most complicated tools in literature, and if I were to start talking about it, we'd be here for like 8 hours, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. But point of view, basically, as a writer, is how you choose to tell the story, whose perspective, and like, does the POV switch? What tense do you use? Do you have a framing device? Is it linear timeline wise? Is it non-linear? It's a very, very complicated tool, and the nuances about how you use it will change how the entire story vibes and how like we read the entire story. So like in terms of like trans coding from a transmasculine point of view, if I was assigned to write a character and I couldn't make him canonically transmasculine, but I had to code him as transmasculine, or I wanted to, I wouldn't be relying on his voice or his physical features. One, because I think that that's over relied on, and two, I think that it's inherently less interesting. I'd probably focus more on like his relationship with his own masculinity and how other people view him from a lens of masculinity. So like, um generally speaking, like, at least from a personal angle, because I can only speak for myself, I have a really complicated relationship with masculinity. It's not just as simple as, because of my gender identity, I view myself as masculine, therefore I express that, which is like, that is true, but it is more complicated than that. I have like a lot of experiences in my life, generally speaking, being viewed as not a man, which have impacted how I live my life. It's impacted how I've been treated. so it impacts my view on it. Like, if you have been mistreated by a lot of cis men in your life, you might not have the most positive view of masculinity, right? And let's say that's the case, but let's say that you're also a trans man. It puts you in a very strange position. Um, but it doesn't necessarily push you to having community, with a lot of cis women necessarily, because they can also be just as bad in terms of trying to push you away from transitioning as well. So you're kind of in this limbo of you you feel the need to prove that you are masculine due to due to people insinuating that you aren't, but then you also don't want to be told how you need to present yourself, nor do you want to have to push yourself into acting a certain way that might remind you of other people who've mistreated you, and it also probably isn't authentic to your identity either. So when I'm writing transmasculine characters, their relationship to this is a huge part of what I'm writing about. And if I was to write a character basically as a trans man without canonically saying that he's a trans man, I'd be focusing a lot more on that. And I think that whenever I've read stories written by trans guys, even if there are male characters that are not explicitly trans in the story, that tends to be a thing that gets touched on with those characters, that are to some extent extensions of the author or their experiences, that sort of thing. And I do have some in here that are allegories and extensions of like authorial experience that aren't canonically transmasculine, but that allegorically in a lot of ways are, due to the way that they're written. And it's complicated. It's not a one-to-one. It doesn't match a lot of the ways that transmasculine characters are coded by people from with an outside perspective of us, because it's kind of like looking through like warped glass at something, and on one side of it it looks one way, and on the other side it looks a completely different way. So I have a very complicated relationship with transcoding, because while a character like Erik is obviously a character that was made with a lot of, I would say, like, a lot of love. He's a wonderful character. I don't think the coding was intentional, but if it was obviously done in very good faith. And then in like other examples that I'll discuss later in this series, the character might be canonically transmasculine, right? But like there were lots of hints dropped before it was revealed. In those cases, a lot of them are very good faith as well. But the point of view is, because it is so outside of the perspective of a transmasculine person, it does read as a little bit like, I don't know. I guess it's not something that I would read and go, oh, I connect to that, because I kind of don't, but I see what the author is doing, if that makes any sense. And now to round up my thoughts. I do not view Erik, I would argue, I don't really view him as transmasculine representation. I don't think that there's really anything there to view in that sense. I understand why he is viewed that way to some people, and I do genuinely support the idea of headcanoning him, and if, he makes some people feel seen and they connect to him, I think that's wonderful. So this isn't like me being opposed to that read of this character. It's more that I just don't really see it beyond basic unintentional coding and, on to some level, some stereotypes. Not necessarily negative ones, but definitely some, I would say, broad associations that people have with transmasculine people. And one thing that I noticed quite starkly when I was getting a bunch of replies, and like I said before, hundreds, I'm not even done sifting through them all yet. When I got a bunch of replies where people were answering my initial prompt, where they were listing off transmasculine rep, and they were trying to meet 5, and they were trying to, do the challenge. A lot of the ones listed are things like this, where it is headcanoned without really a lot of direct confirmation in the media itself. A lot of them are where the character in question is a minor character. There was one suggestion where someone wrote, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but the person wrote one guy in one scene, but his line was very impactful. And then a lot of it is just like shows or movies or books with women cross-dressing as men, where people kind of read him as trans, but that obviously wasn't the intent by the author, considering that those stories typically end with, the character accepting her femininity again, or going back into being feminine, which, yes, I have examples that I will discuss of that in this too, because that is a huge trope that I feel like goes kind of under discussed in this realm of media analysis. But yeah, a lot of what people were listing falls into those categories, or like it's very allegorical rep, you know what I mean? Or like implied or headcanons, that kind of thing. Very little of it was direct canonical rep, and even less of that was direct canonical rep with a major character in the story. So this is not an Erik depreciation video, because I do like him, and I hope that that shines through. And I do like that people are seeing him to some degree as rep, especially if they feel seen by him. I think that's wonderful. I just want us to get to a point where when it comes to things that we're considering rep, it's like actually representation, you know what I mean? Like we actually have something in the story, you know, implying that it was intentional. We actually have moments in the story where we can see that the character's transness or experiences might be affecting him in some way, in some meaningful way. We're at a point where trans voice actors or actors can play characters that aren't trans, and that doesn't immediately equal to trans coding, because we're so starved to just find a trans guy in something, you know what I mean? I want us to get to that kind of a point where we we don't have to like dig for the tiniest implication to feel like we have any level of representation. So I wanted to make this to discuss that, but I also do want to addendum it by saying that I have a lot of other things that I will be discussing, perhaps more at more length and whatnot, where the representation is absolutely canonical, and a lot of which where he's a major character, and a lot of which where he's a major character and he's written by a transmasculine author. So I have some really like interesting things. The thing I will leave off on, and that is, you're probably watching this searching for this kind of representation. Go look into indie books. Go look into trans indie books by trans people, and I almost guarantee you'll find something that is like almost exactly what you're looking for. I struggled so hard to find any kind of rep like before I was specifically reading a lot of indie books, and then I became, more publicly a writer, and then I connected with a lot of indie authors. And among indie authors and indie books, there's a lot more trans rep, like all around for every single demographic of trans people, versus trad pub books versus like movies, games, all that kind of stuff. So that's where you need to look. That is absolutely where you need to look. But also, like, I don't know, tell me your trans Erik headcanons. Post your trans Erik fanfics. Post links to them in the description, because I also think that fanon is really important too to expressions of queerness and transness as well. So I would say I have a complicated relationship with this, but I would say that it was interesting to look into, and Monster Hunter Wilds is a really fun game, and it has got a really fun story. I'll link the full game movie I watched in the description. Like, let's say you can't, play the game. Let's say you don't really know anyone who's played it, you can go watch it. It's got all the cutscenes and some gameplay in it, and you can still go experience the full story. It's a really fun time, and I hope that you enjoyed watching and found something useful in this discussion. I'll see you next time for a video. Yes, a video. We'll see if it's longer. We'll see what it's about. The next episode will be talking specifically about like things like shape shifting in terms of transrep, which will be very fun because that is also a huge trope that I have a lot to say about. But until next time, have yourselves a good day.